Deep in the Tennessee mountains, where autumn rain turned dirt roads to mud, Claire stood trembling on her late husband's family estate, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other gripping her 8-year-old daughter Emma's small shoulders. Behind them, her mother-in-law's cold voice cut through the downpour, declaring them unwelcome in the only home they had known since her husband died 6 months ago. The heavy oak door slammed with a finality that shattered their world. Emma's silent tears mixed with the rain as they stumbled toward their rusted sedan, carrying only 2 hastily packed duffel bags and a tattered envelope her husband had pressed into her hands the night before he passed, begging her to keep it safe but never open it. She had promised. But standing there in the storm, penniless and cast out, what could that forgotten letter contain? What secret had her husband been desperate to protect, and why was his own family so determined to see her destroyed? The rain hammered against the rusted sedan with a relentless fury, each drop striking the metal roof like a tiny fist demanding entry into their fragile sanctuary. Claire sat in the driver's seat, her body twisted at an awkward angle so she could reach into the back where Emma lay curled beneath their only blanket, a thin cotton thing that had seen better days and offered little protection against the November cold that seeped through every crack and crevice of the aging vehicle. Her daughter's small body trembled despite Claire's best efforts, and every few minutes Emma would whimper in her fitful sleep, a sound that tore at Claire's heart with more violence than any storm ever could. Claire's right hand rested protectively on Emma's shoulder, her fingers gently stroking the child's damp hair, while her left hand pressed against her swollen belly where her unborn child moved restlessly, as if sensing the fear and uncertainty that filled the cramped space. The dashboard clock glowed a sickly green, marking the agonizingly slow passage of time, each minute an eternity of discomfort and worry. On the passenger seat beside her, barely visible in the darkness broken only by occasional flashes of lightning, sat the envelope. It was a simple manila envelope, creased and worn from being carried in Daniel's jacket pocket during his final days, and it seemed to pulse with an almost living presence in the shadows. Claire's eyes were drawn to it again and again, her exhausted mind circling the same desperate questions like a moth around a flame. What secrets did it hold? What had Daniel been so desperate to protect, so urgent to hide, that he had made her swear with his dying breath never to open it unless she had absolutely no other choice? She reached for it twice during that endless night, her fingers trembling with cold and temptation, but each time she pulled back, remembering the fear in Daniel's eyes, the desperate grip of his hand on hers, the raw panic in his voice when he whispered, "Promise me, Claire, promise me you will not open this until you have no choice left. When that time comes, you will know." She had promised, and even now, shivering in a car with $47 to her name and nowhere to call home, she could not bring herself to break that vow. Dawn came slowly, the storm gradually exhausting itself into a cold drizzle, and the gray light revealed a world washed clean but offering no warmth, no comfort, no answers. Emma woke with red-rimmed eyes and said nothing, but her small hand found Claire's and held tight. Claire started the car, grateful when the engine turned over despite her fears, and drove through the empty streets until she found what she was looking for on the very edge of town, where respectability ended and desperation began. The Riverside Motel was a collection of single-story units, painted a faded turquoise that might have been cheerful decades ago, its neon sign flickering weakly in the morning gloom, advertising vacancy in pink letters that buzzed like dying insects. The office was small and smelled of burnt coffee and cigarette smoke that had soaked into every surface over the years. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman whose face was a map of her own hard journey through life, deep lines carved around eyes that had seen too much suffering to judge anyone else's. She looked at Claire, then at Emma's frightened face pressed against her mother's side, then at Claire's obvious pregnancy, and something softened in her expression. Without asking questions that would require painful answers, she quoted a price that took 40 of Claire's $47, then silently poured 2 cups of stale coffee from a pot that had been sitting too long on the burner, and produced a handful of crackers wrapped in cellophane from a drawer behind the desk, pushing them across the counter with a gentleness that spoke of understanding, of having once stood where Claire stood now, of knowing that sometimes the smallest kindness is the difference between survival and surrender. The motel room was a rectangle of faded despair, its walls the color of old dishwater, decorated with water stains that spread across the ceiling like brown continents on a map of nowhere. The carpet, once perhaps burgundy but now a mottled gray-brown, felt sticky beneath Claire's feet as she helped Emma out of her damp clothes and wrapped her in a towel that was thin and scratchy but at least dry. The heater beneath the window rattled and wheezed, producing more noise than warmth, but it was something, a mechanical heartbeat in a room that felt otherwise lifeless. Claire sat on the edge of the sagging double bed, its floral bedspread worn so thin in places that the mattress showed through, and pulled Emma onto her lap, ignoring the protest of her pregnant body as she held her daughter close. Emma's voice, small and confused, broke the silence that had stretched between them since they left the estate. "Mommy, why did grandmother make us leave?" The question was innocent, asked with the pure incomprehension of an 8-year-old who could not fathom why family would turn cruel, why love would transform into ice, why the home she had known since her father died would suddenly become a place where she was unwanted. Claire felt the words like a blade sliding between her ribs, sharp and cold, but she forced her face into a smile that felt like cracking glass. "Grandmother is going through a very hard time, sweetheart," she said, each word a lie that tasted bitter on her tongue but felt necessary, essential even, because Emma was too young to understand that some people's hearts were made of stone. That grief could twist into something ugly and vindictive, that Daniel's mother had looked at her pregnant daughter-in-law and grandchild not with compassion but with cold calculation. "She needs some time alone to heal, and we need to give her that space. We're going to be just fine, you and me and the baby. We're going to have our own adventure." Emma seemed to accept this explanation, or perhaps she simply chose to believe it because the alternative was too frightening. And she curled against Claire's chest, her thumb finding its way to her mouth in a habit she had abandoned 2 years ago but now reclaimed as comfort. As Emma's breathing eventually deepened into sleep, exhaustion finally claiming her small body, Claire carefully laid her daughter on the bed and covered her with both the motel blanket and their own thin one from the car, creating a cocoon that might keep the cold at bay for a few hours. Then Claire's eyes found the envelope where it sat on the nightstand beside the lamp with its stained shade, and the weight of it seemed to fill the entire room, a presence both compelling and terrifying. She moved to the window, parting the heavy curtain just enough to see the parking lot where their car sat alone beneath a flickering streetlight, and allowed herself to remember Daniel's final days in the hospital. He had been dying slowly, the cancer consuming him from within despite the doctor's best efforts, and she had sat beside his bed day after day, holding his hand and telling him stories about Emma, about the baby growing inside her, about the future they would never share. But in those final weeks, something had changed in Daniel's eyes. He had become anxious, almost frantic at times, and she would catch him staring at her with an expression she could not read, something that looked like fear mixed with desperate love and terrible regret. He would open his mouth as if to speak, words hovering on his lips, but then he would close it again and turn away, and she knew he was holding something back, some secret that weighed on him like stones in deep water. Then, 3 nights before he died, he had gripped her hand with surprising strength and pressed the envelope into her palm. His voice, already weakened to a whisper by the disease ravaging his lungs, had been urgent and clear. "Promise me you will keep this safe. Do not open it until you have no other choice. When that time comes, you will know." She had promised, confused but willing to give him this final piece, and he had relaxed slightly, though the fear never quite left his eyes. Now, standing in this dismal room with $7 left to her name, her daughter sleeping fitfully behind her, and nowhere to go when morning came, Claire wondered if this was the moment Daniel had foreseen. If this desperation was the key that should unlock whatever secrets that envelope contained, but still she could not bring herself to break her promise. Not yet. Not while some small, stubborn part of her believed that tomorrow might bring something better, some solution she had not yet imagined, some path forward that would not require betraying the last wish of the man she loved. Morning came too quickly, the weak sunlight filtering through the thin curtains, doing nothing to soften the harsh reality that Claire faced as she counted the 7 remaining dollars in her worn wallet, spreading the bills on the nightstand as if staring at them might somehow multiply their value. Emma sat cross-legged on the bed, her small face solemn as she worked on a drawing with the 2 crayons Claire had salvaged from the bottom of her purse, creating pictures of houses with smiling families that felt like accusations of everything Claire had failed to provide. The elderly motel clerk had told Claire they could stay 1 more night without paying. A kindness that brought tears to Claire's eyes, but also the knowledge that charity had limits, and tomorrow they would be back in the car, unless she found work today, immediately, without delay. She dressed in her cleanest outfit, a simple blue blouse that stretched tight across her pregnant belly, and a pair of black pants held together with a safety pin where the button no longer closed. And she brushed her hair until it shone, trying to create an illusion of capability and normalcy, despite the exhaustion that carved shadows beneath her eyes. She left Emma with strict instructions to stay in the room, to not open the door for anyone, to draw and rest and be brave, and the look of fear in her daughter's eyes, as Claire closed the door behind her, was almost enough to break her resolve entirely. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Claire walked its main street with desperate purpose, entering every establishment that might possibly need help. The hardware store owner took one look at her condition and shook his head before she even finished asking. The grocery store manager, a thin man with suspicious eyes, told her they only hired locals with references, his tone making it clear that a pregnant stranger qualified as neither. At a small boutique, the owner actually laughed, a cruel tinkling sound, and said that customers did not want to be served by someone who looked like they might give birth between the changing rooms and the cash register. Each rejection was a stone added to the weight Claire carried, and by the time she reached the fourth establishment, a diner called Margaret's Place situated on the corner where Main Street intersected with the highway, she was fighting to keep the desperation from showing on her face. The diner was a classic American roadside establishment, all chrome and red vinyl, with a long counter lined with stools and booths along the windows that offered views of passing traffic and the gray November sky. The lunch rush was just beginning, and through the window Claire could see waitresses moving efficiently between tables, carrying plates of food that made her stomach clench with hunger she had been trying to ignore. She pushed through the door, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon was so overwhelming in its normalcy, its promise of sustenance and simple comfort, that she had to pause and steady herself. Behind the counter stood a woman who could only be Margaret, her silver hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, her face weathered but strong, wearing a white apron over jeans and a flannel shirt. And when she looked up and met Claire's eyes, something passed between them, a recognition that transcended words. Claire approached, her prepared speech about her willingness to work hard and learn quickly already forming on her lips. But before she could begin, Margaret raised a hand to stop her and said simply, "You look like you need coffee and a meal before we talk about anything else." The kindness in those words, so unexpected after the morning's harsh rejections, almost undid Claire completely, but she forced herself to nod and accept, sliding onto a stool that creaked under her weight. Margaret poured coffee, black and strong, and slid a plate of eggs and toast across the counter without being asked, without expecting payment. And while Claire ate with as much dignity as she could muster despite her ravenous hunger, Margaret worked and watched, her sharp eyes missing nothing, not the worn clothes or the trembling hands or the obvious bulge of pregnancy that other employers had used as an excuse to turn her away. When Claire finished, Margaret leaned against the counter and asked 3 simple questions, her voice direct but not unkind. Can you work hard? Can you show up on time? Can you treat customers with respect even when they do not deserve it? Claire answered yes to all 3. Her voice steady despite the hope that was building in her chest like a fragile bird testing its wings. Margaret nodded once, decisive, and said, "I need someone in the kitchen washing dishes and bussing tables, and when you are not too tired, you can help wait tables during the dinner rush. I pay cash at the end of each day, nothing fancy, but enough to get by if you are careful. You start now." The relief that flooded through Claire was so powerful, so overwhelming, that she barely managed to thank Margaret before rushing to the bathroom, where she locked herself in a stall and wept silently, her shoulders shaking with sobs that were equal parts gratitude and the release of a fear she had been carrying since the moment Victoria's door had slammed in her face, and for the first time since Daniel died. She allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she and Emma might actually survive this after all. The work at Margaret's diner was exhausting in a way that Claire's body, already strained by pregnancy and stress, struggled to endure, but it was also salvation. Each day bringing a small handful of cash that meant another night at the motel, another meal, another tiny step away from the abyss that had nearly swallowed them whole. By the end of her first week, Claire's hands were raw from dishwater and her feet ached in a way that made every step a small agony. But Emma's drawings had begun to include smiling suns again, and that alone made every moment of pain worthwhile. It was on a Thursday evening, as Claire fumbled with the motel room key while balancing a paper bag containing the dinner Margaret had insisted she take home, that she first truly noticed the man who lived in the room next to theirs. He was elderly, perhaps in his mid-70s, with a full head of white hair neatly combed and a face that reminded Claire of her own grandfather, all kind wrinkles and gentle eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to understand that judgment helped no one. He stood outside his door, room 7 to their room 8, and he nodded at her with a courtesy that felt like it came from another era entirely. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice a pleasant rumble, warm as summer thunder. "I'm Henry Watkins. I've been meaning to introduce myself properly." Claire managed a tired smile, shifting Emma's weight against her hip as her daughter clung to her with the exhaustion of a long day spent confined to a small room. "Claire," she offered simply, too weary for more elaborate introductions. Over the next few days, she would see Mr. Watkins in passing, and each time he would offer a friendly greeting, never intrusive but always present, a steady and reassuring presence in a world that had proven itself unstable and cruel. Then, on the following Tuesday, as Claire returned from her shift at the diner with Emma dragging her feet behind her, Mr. Watkins stepped out of his room and made an offer that seemed to cost him nothing but meant everything to a woman who had forgotten what simple human kindness looked like. "I've made a pot of soup," he said, gesturing to his open door where warm light spilled out into the gathering dusk. "Far too much for one old man. Would you and your daughter do me the honor of helping me eat it? Nothing fancy. Just vegetable soup and some bread, but it's hot, and there's plenty." Claire hesitated, instincts honed by recent cruelty making her suspicious of generosity. But Emma's face had lit up at the mention of food, and the smell drifting from his room was so inviting, so reminiscent of safety and home, that Claire found herself nodding acceptance. His room was identical to theirs in layout, but transformed entirely by the personal touches of someone who had made it a temporary home rather than just a place to sleep. A small table was set with mismatched bowls and spoons, and the soup, thick with vegetables and herbs, steamed in a pot on the single burner he had set up in the corner. They ate together, and Mr. Watkins filled the space with gentle stories about his late wife Martha, how they had traveled across the country in an old RV for 3 years after his retirement, how she had passed peacefully in her sleep 2 winters ago, how he now spent his time moving from place to place because staying still in their old house made her absence too loud to bear. He asked Emma about her drawings, admired her artwork with genuine interest, and made her laugh with silly voices and old jokes that should not have been funny but somehow were when delivered with his grandfatherly warmth. As Emma's eyelids grew heavy and she curled up on Mr. Watkins' bed with a threadbare blanket he gently draped over her, he turned to Claire with eyes that saw far too much, that recognized the signs of someone carrying burdens too heavy for one person alone. "I don't mean to pry," he said quietly, his voice pitched low so as not to wake the sleeping child, "but I've been around long enough to recognize trouble when I see it. You're running from something, or someone. You don't have to tell me if you'd rather not, but sometimes it helps to share the weight." Claire felt tears prick her eyes, and perhaps it was the exhaustion, or the kindness, or simply the desperate need to tell someone, anyone, that her life had fallen apart through no fault of her own, but she found herself speaking. She told him about Daniel, about their quiet, happy life, about the cancer that took him too soon, about the 6 months of grief that followed. She told him about Victoria, about the cold rejection, about being thrown out with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a handful of dollars. She spoke until her voice grew hoarse, and Mr. Watkins listened without interruption, without judgment, nodding occasionally to show he heard, that he understood, that her pain was valid and real. What she did not tell him, what she kept locked away in the deepest part of her heart, was about the envelope that still sat on her nightstand in the room next door, the secret Daniel had died protecting, the mystery she was not yet desperate enough to unravel. The 3rd week at Margaret's diner had begun to establish a rhythm that felt almost like normalcy, the kind of routine that allowed Claire to imagine, in her more optimistic moments, that they might actually build a life here in this small town where no one knew their history or their pain. She was refilling coffee cups during the lunch rush on a Wednesday, moving between tables with the practiced efficiency she had developed, when she felt the weight of eyes upon her, that primitive instinct that tells a person when they are being watched. She looked up and through the large front window spotted a man standing on the sidewalk across the street, and everything about him screamed wealth and purpose in a way that felt profoundly wrong in this blue-collar town. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Claire made in 6 months, his silver hair perfectly styled, his posture rigid with the confidence of someone accustomed to power and getting exactly what he wanted. He was not looking at the diner generally, but specifically at her, his gaze fixed and unwavering, and when their eyes met through the glass, he did not look away or pretend he had been admiring something else. He simply stared, his expression unreadable, and Claire felt ice slide down her spine despite the warmth of the diner. She turned away, forcing her trembling hands to steady as she continued her work, but when she glanced back 10 minutes later, he was gone, leaving only the unsettling certainty that his presence had not been coincidental. The afternoon dragged with an anxiety that made every moment feel stretched and distorted, and when her shift finally ended and she collected Emma from the motel where the elderly clerk had agreed to check on her periodically, Claire noticed the black sedan immediately. It was parked 3 spaces down from their room, a luxury vehicle so out of place in the Riverside Motel's cracked parking lot that it might as well have been a spaceship, its dark windows reflecting the fading daylight like mirrors that revealed nothing of what lay within. Claire hurried Emma into their room, her heart hammering against her ribs, and she had barely closed the door when she heard a gentle knock. For a terrible moment she thought it might be the man from the sedan, but Mr. Watkins' familiar voice calling, "Claire, it's Henry," brought a relief so profound she nearly collapsed. She opened the door to find him standing there, his usually cheerful face drawn with concern, and he stepped inside quickly, closing the door behind him. "Someone was asking about you," he said without preamble, his voice low and urgent. "I was coming back from getting groceries about an hour ago, and I saw a man talking to Betty at the front desk. Well-dressed fellow, expensive suit. He was showing her a photograph and asking questions. Betty, bless her heart, told him she didn't recognize anyone in the picture and didn't give out information about guests, but he left her a business card and a $100 bill. I saw it, Claire. He's trying to find you, and he's willing to pay for information." The fear that had been a low simmer all afternoon exploded into full panic, and Claire sank onto the edge of the bed, one hand instinctively moving to her belly, where the baby rolled and kicked, blissfully unaware of the danger gathering around them like storm clouds. Emma looked between the adults with wide, frightened eyes, and Mr. Watkins, sensing the child's distress, gently suggested she work on her drawings in his room for a little while, offering the bribe of cookies he had bought at the store. Once Emma was safely next door, Claire told Mr. Watkins about the man she had seen watching the diner, and his face grew grave as he nodded, confirming what she already knew in her bones. "They're the same person," he said simply. "Question is, who sent him and what does he want?" After Mr. Watkins left, promising to keep watch and alert Claire to any further suspicious activity, she sat in the growing darkness of the room and stared at the envelope on the nightstand. Her hand reached for it, fingers touching the worn manila paper, and she could almost hear Daniel's voice in her memory, feel the desperate grip of his hand, see the fear that had made his dying eyes bright with unshed tears. "Promise me, you will keep this safe. Do not open it until you have no other choice. When that time comes, you will know." She lifted the envelope, feeling its weight, and in the dim light she could see that the seal was still intact, Daniel's careful tape job still holding after all these months. She could open it now, right now, and perhaps find answers to questions she did not even know to ask, but something stopped her. It was not just the promise, though that held weight enough, but rather the memory of Daniel's fear, the way his whole body had trembled when he pressed the envelope into her hands. The panic in his voice that suggested opening it too soon might bring consequences worse than ignorance. She set it back on the nightstand, decision made, and even as the black sedan remained in the parking lot like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike, even as fear coiled in her stomach and made sleep impossible, she chose to wait, to honor Daniel's last request, to trust that when the moment came for revelation, she would recognize it with the certainty he had promised. The nightmares began on the 4th night after the man in the black sedan first appeared, Emma's small voice crying out in the darkness, pulling Claire from her own fitful sleep to find her daughter thrashing against sheets soaked with sweat and tears. "Daddy's gone, Mommy, Daddy's gone and we can't find him," Emma sobbed, and Claire held her close, rocking her like an infant, whispering reassurances that felt hollow even as she spoke them, because she could not promise that everything would be fine when she did not believe it herself. The bedwetting came next, accidents that Emma had not experienced since she was 3 years old. and the shame in her daughter's eyes each morning as they stripped the sheets together was almost worse than the practical problem of washing and drying them in the motel's coin laundry with money they could barely spare. But what truly terrified Claire was the withdrawal. The way Emma stopped drawing her pictures of houses and families. The way she stopped asking questions or requesting stories. The way she would sit for hours, staring at nothing while her small hands twisted the fabric of her shirt into knots. This was not the resilient, bright child who had weathered her father's death with the adaptability of youth, and Claire understood with a clarity that felt like a knife to the heart that the motel room, with its stained walls and the constant fear of the black sedan in the parking lot, was destroying her daughter in ways that would leave scars no eye could see. It was Margaret who noticed first. Margaret, who asked Claire to stay after her shift ended one evening and sat her down in a corner booth with coffee and the kind of straightforward compassion that cut through pretense like a blade through butter. "That child is suffering," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm, "and you're killing yourself, trying to keep her safe in a place that's not fit for a dog, much less a pregnant woman and a traumatized little girl. I've got an apartment upstairs, been empty since my last tenant moved out 3 months ago. It's small, just 1 bedroom and a kitchen. Bathroom needs some work, but it's clean, and it's got heat that actually works. I'll rent it to you for what you're making on weekdays, and weekends you work for free to cover the difference. It's not charity, Claire. It's business. Because I need someone reliable, and you need a real home." Claire had wept then, unable to stop the tears that came from a well of gratitude so deep she had not known it existed. And 2 days later she and Emma packed their meager belongings into the 2 duffel bags and 3 plastic grocery sacks that contained everything they owned in the world. Mr. Watkins helped carry things up the narrow stairs at the back of the diner, his old hands steady and strong as he made multiple trips despite Claire's protests that she could manage. The apartment was indeed small, barely larger than the motel room, but it had windows that looked out over the street and let in actual sunlight. And the bedroom had a real closet, and the kitchen had a stove that worked, and to Claire it felt like a palace after weeks of the Riverside Motel's oppressive grimness. As she unpacked Emma's backpack, shaking out the few clothes her daughter owned, and folding them carefully into the dresser drawer Margaret had left behind, a photograph slipped out from between 2 shirts and fell to the floor. Claire picked it up, and her breath caught in her throat. It was an old picture, the kind taken with an instant camera. Its colors faded to the soft pastels of age, and it showed Daniel standing between 2 other people in front of what looked like a large estate house. Daniel appeared younger, perhaps in his early 20s, his smile bright and unguarded in a way Claire had rarely seen during their years together. On his left stood Victoria, unmistakable even in the photograph's faded state, her elegant beauty frozen in time but her smile somehow cold, even captured in a moment meant to convey happiness. On Daniel's right was another person, or rather the ghost of another person, because someone had taken a sharp object and scratched across the face with such violence that the photograph's surface was torn and shredded, obliterating every feature until only a vague, human-shaped outline remained. Claire called Emma over, keeping her voice carefully neutral despite the ice forming in her veins. "Sweetheart, where did you get this picture?" Emma looked at it, her small face troubled, and said softly, "Grandmother gave it to me the day before we left. She said I should keep it to remember the family, to remember where I came from. She said Daddy would want me to have it." Claire studied the photograph as Emma returned to arranging her few toys in the corner, and her mind raced with questions that had no answers. Who was the person whose face had been destroyed with such deliberate hatred? Why had Victoria given this defaced image to an innocent child? What message was embedded in this act of violence against a photograph? And what did it have to do with the envelope that even now sat in her purse? Daniel's secrets waiting for the moment of absolute necessity that he had foreseen but Claire had not yet reached? 2 months had passed since they moved into the apartment above Margaret's diner, 2 months of relentless work that left Claire's body screaming in protest, while her will pushed it forward with a determination born of pure necessity. The pregnancy was advancing rapidly now, her belly swollen and heavy, the baby inside her growing stronger and more active with each passing day, its movements sometimes so vigorous they took her breath away. The physical demands of waitressing, the constant standing and walking and carrying heavy trays, the bending and reaching and cleaning, all of it had become a form of torture that Claire endured through sheer stubborn refusal to surrender, but her body was beginning to rebel in ways she could not ignore. It happened on a Thursday evening during the dinner rush, Claire balancing a tray loaded with plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, moving between tables with the mechanical efficiency of exhaustion, when suddenly the world tilted sideways and her vision narrowed to a tunnel of graying light. She felt the tray slipping from her hands, heard the crash of breaking dishes as if from very far away, and then Margaret's strong arms were around her, lowering her into a chair while concerned voices swirled overhead like birds circling a drowning swimmer. When her vision cleared, Margaret's face was inches from her own, lined with worry and something that looked like anger, though Claire understood it was not anger at her but at the circumstances that had driven a pregnant woman to work herself into near collapse. Margaret did not ask if Claire was all right or suggest that perhaps she should rest. She simply stated with the flat finality of someone whose decision was not open for debate that they were closing early and going to the clinic, and she would hear no arguments about money or necessity or any other excuse Claire might manufacture. The clinic was a small storefront operation 3 blocks away, staffed by a doctor who looked too young to have finished medical school but whose examination was thorough and professional. He listened to the baby's heartbeat, measured Claire's blood pressure, asked questions about her diet and sleep and stress levels, and when he finished, he sat back and fixed her with a look that combined compassion with brutal honesty. "Your blood pressure is dangerously high," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're malnourished, exhausted, and your body is under a level of stress that is not sustainable. If you continue on this path, you're risking preeclampsia, premature labor, or worse. I'm not just talking about your health, Mrs. Morrison. I'm talking about your baby's survival. Whatever you're doing, whatever you think you have to do, you need to find another way, because this will kill both of you." The words hit Claire like physical blows, each one landing with the weight of truth she had been trying desperately to ignore. And as Margaret drove her home in silence, paid for the visit without comment or expectation of repayment, and hugged her with surprising fierceness before leaving her at the apartment door, Claire felt something crack inside her. That last wall of denial crumbling to reveal the abyss she had been dancing along the edge of for months. Emma was spending the night with Mr. Watkins, an arrangement that had become their Friday tradition, the old man delighting in teaching her card games and letting her stay up past bedtime to watch old movies on his small television. And so Claire was alone when she finally sat down at the kitchen table and pulled the envelope from her purse. The apartment was silent, except for the distant sounds of traffic and the hum of the refrigerator. And in that silence the envelope seemed to pulse with a life of its own, Daniel's final secret waiting for the moment he had known would come. Claire's hands trembled as she held it, and she could hear his voice as clearly as if he stood beside her, feel the desperation in his grip, see the fear and love mingled in his dying eyes. "Do not open it until you have no other choice. When that time comes, you will know." She knew. God help her, she finally knew. The doctor's words echoed in her mind, a death sentence delivered with clinical precision, and she understood that she had reached the moment Daniel had foreseen, the point where survival required truth, no matter how terrible that truth might be. Her fingers found the edge of the tape that sealed the envelope, and with a prayer that was half plea and half apology to the husband who had tried so hard to protect her, Claire broke the seal and opened the envelope, ready at last to discover what secret had been worth dying to hide. The envelope opened with a soft, tearing sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent apartment, and Claire's hands shook so violently that she had to set it down on the table before she could reach inside to extract its contents. 3 items slipped out onto the worn formica surface, each one a piece of a puzzle she had not known existed, clues to a mystery that Daniel had carried to his grave. The first was a small brass key attached to a white plastic tag stamped with black numbers, 347. The metal cold and surprisingly heavy in her palm. The second was a business card, its surface slightly yellowed with age, embossed with elegant lettering that read, "Sterling and Patterson, Attorneys at Law," with an address in Nashville and a phone number written in blue ink across the bottom. The third item was a letter, folded carefully, written in Daniel's familiar handwriting on lined notebook paper, and Claire had to blink away tears that blurred her vision before she could read the words her dead husband had left for her. "My darling Claire." It began, and even those 3 words were enough to make her breath catch because she could hear his voice speaking them, could feel his presence so strongly it was as if he sat beside her in the empty kitchen. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are in trouble. I am so sorry. I am sorry for the lies, sorry for the secrets, sorry for leaving you alone to face what is coming. You deserved the truth, and I was too much of a coward to give it to you. My family is not who you think they are. Neither am I." Claire stopped reading, her heart hammering against her ribs, and she had to force herself to continue. Each word a revelation that shattered the foundation of everything she thought she knew about the man she had married and loved. The key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown, box 347. Inside you will find everything you need to protect yourself and our children. Documents, evidence, proof of who I really am and what my family has done. I wanted to tell you so many times, wanted to prepare you, but I thought if I kept you in the darkness you would be safe, that ignorance would be your shield. I was wrong. I see that now. Trust no one in my family, not my mother, not my brother if he is still alive, not anyone who claims connection to the Ashworth name. They will try to take everything from you. They will lie, manipulate, threaten. They are capable of things you cannot imagine, things I have seen and can never unsee. Go to the lawyers. Ask specifically for James Patterson. He is the only one outside of my immediate family who knows the whole truth. He has been preparing for this moment, for the day when you would need help, and I would not be there to give it. He will guide you, protect you, help you claim what is rightfully yours and our children's. I love you, Claire. I have loved you from the moment I saw you in that bookstore, loved you with a purity I did not know I was still capable of after the poison of my childhood. You gave me 3 years of peace, of normalcy, of feeling like a real human being instead of a pawn in a game I never wanted to play. Emma is the light of my life, and the baby you carry is my hope for redemption, for a legacy that is not stained with the sins of my family. Protect them, fight for them. Use what is in that box to build the life I wanted to give you but could not. Forgive me for the lies, forgive me for dying, forgive me for loving you enough to marry you but not enough to tell you the truth. Your Daniel. The letter ended there, his signature a scrawl that looked like it had been written in haste or anguish, or both, and Claire sat staring at it until the words began to blur and run together, her mind unable to process the enormity of what she had just read. The Ashworth name meant nothing to her, or at least she thought it did not, though something about it tugged at the edges of her memory like a forgotten dream. Daniel had kept secrets, enormous life-altering secrets, had built their entire relationship on a foundation of carefully constructed lies, and yet the love in his letter felt real, desperately and painfully real. She looked at the key, at the business card, at the letter that had turned her understanding of her marriage inside out, and she understood that opening the envelope had not provided answers but had instead opened a door into a much larger and more dangerous mystery, one that involved safety deposit boxes and lawyers, and a family dangerous enough that Daniel had fled them, hidden from them, and ultimately failed to escape them. Claire read the letter 3 times, then 4, then lost count as the words began to sear themselves into her memory, each reading revealing new layers of questions that had no answers, and deepening the chasm of confusion and fear that yawned before her, like a physical thing she might fall into and never stop falling. What truth had been so terrible that Daniel could not speak it even as death approached, even when he knew she would be left alone and vulnerable? What could be inside a safety deposit box that would protect her and the children? And protect them from what, exactly? The Ashworth name hovered in her mind like a ghost she could not quite see clearly, and she found herself whispering it aloud, tasting the syllables, trying to dredge up some memory or association that would make sense of Daniel's cryptic warnings. His family is dangerous, he had written, capable of things she could not imagine, and yet he had attended Sunday dinners with Victoria after their marriage, had played the dutiful son, had never once hinted at anything more sinister than the ordinary dysfunction that plagued most families. The lies felt like betrayal, but the love in his letter felt equally real, and Claire could not reconcile how both could exist simultaneously in the same man, the same marriage, the same life she had thought she understood. Morning came eventually, though Claire had not slept, and when Emma returned from her sleepover with Mr. Watkins, chattering happily about the card games they had played and the popcorn they had eaten, Claire managed to smile and nod and pretend that her world had not been turned completely upside down. After breakfast, after Emma settled in with her coloring books, Claire slipped next door and knocked softly on Mr. Watkins' door, the letter folded in her pocket like a bomb waiting to detonate. He opened immediately, took one look at her face, and ushered her inside without a word, closing the door and guiding her to the small chair by his window. Claire handed him the letter without preamble, and she watched his face as he read. watched the way his expression shifted from curiosity to concern to something that looked almost like recognition, as if pieces of a puzzle he had been working on independently were suddenly falling into place. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her, and his voice when he spoke was grave in a way she had never heard from the usually cheerful old man. "I saw the black sedan again yesterday," he said, and Claire felt her stomach drop. It was parked across from the diner around mid-afternoon, and the man inside had a camera with a long lens. "He was taking photographs, Claire, documenting your movements, building some kind of file on you. I walked past and got a good look at him, and I'll tell you what my 30 years in law enforcement taught me to recognize. That's not some private investigator working a cheating spouse case. That's corporate security, maybe worse, the kind of professional who works for people with money and no conscience. The revelation that Mr. People Watkins had been in law enforcement, not just a postal worker as she had assumed, barely registered against the terror of knowing she was being actively surveilled, hunted even, by professionals who clearly knew things about her that she did not know about herself. Mr. Watkins leaned forward, his old hands steady as he gripped her shaking ones, and his advice came with the weight of experience behind it. "Do not go to that bank yet," he said firmly. "Whatever is in that box, they probably know about it, and they might be watching for you to show up. Contact the lawyer first. If your husband trusted him enough to make him the gatekeeper to this information, then he needs to be your first move. Get legal protection before you do anything else, because once you open that box, there's no going back to ignorance, and ignorance right now is the only thing keeping you safe." That night, after Emma was asleep and the apartment was dark except for the small light over the kitchen sink, Claire dialed the number on the business card with fingers that trembled so badly she misdialed twice before getting it right. A woman answered, professional and courteous, identifying the firm as Sterling and Patterson, and when Claire asked in a voice barely above a whisper if she could speak to James Patterson, there was a brief pause followed by a response that made Claire's heart leap and sink simultaneously. "May I ask who's calling?" The receptionist inquired, and when Claire gave her name, adding hesitantly that it concerned Daniel Morrison, the woman's tone changed immediately, becoming warmer and somehow urgent. "Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Patterson has been hoping you would call. He's been trying to locate you for some time. He has an opening tomorrow at 10 a.m. if you can make it to Nashville. He said to tell you if you ever called, that it's urgent you meet as soon as possible." The bus to Nashville left at 7 in the morning, and Claire stood in the cold pre-dawn darkness outside the diner, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Clutching a paper bag containing the sandwich Margaret had pressed into her hands, along with $40 for emergencies and strict instructions to be careful, to call if she needed anything, to remember that Emma would be perfectly safe in Margaret's care. The old Greyhound rumbled and swayed along highways that cut through the Tennessee countryside, past towns that looked like the one she was leaving, past lives being lived in houses she would never enter. And Claire pressed her forehead against the cold window and watched it all blur past while her mind spun with fear and questions that multiplied faster than she could contain them. Nashville rose before her like a city from a dream, all tall buildings and morning traffic that seemed impossibly fast and chaotic after months in a town where 3 cars at a stoplight constituted a traffic jam. And as she navigated the unfamiliar streets following the address written on the business card, Claire felt acutely aware of how small she was, how vulnerable, a pregnant woman alone in a strange city chasing secrets her dead husband had hidden. The law offices of Sterling and Patterson occupied the 15th floor of a glass and steel tower that seemed to touch the gray November sky, and the elevator ride up felt like ascending into another world entirely, a place of money and power so far removed from her reality of diners and motel rooms that she half expected someone to stop her and demand to know what business a woman in worn jeans and a threadbare coat had in such an establishment. The reception area was all polished wood and leather furniture, the kind of calculated elegance that whispered of expensive hourly rates and clients who did not worry about next month's rent. And the receptionist who greeted her was the same woman who had answered the phone, her smile professional but somehow genuine as she said Mr. Patterson was expecting her and please have a seat, he would be right out. Claire had barely settled into a chair when a door opened and a man emerged, and she knew immediately this was James Patterson. Knew it from the way his eyes found her instantly, and the way his entire face transformed with an expression that was equal parts profound relief and deep sadness. He was perhaps in his mid-50s, with silver hair and the kind of distinguished appearance that belonged in courtrooms and boardrooms, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Claire's car. But his eyes, when he looked at her, held a kindness that transcended his expensive presentation. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, his voice rich and warm despite the gravity she could hear beneath it, and he crossed the reception area with quick strides to take her hand in both of his. Thank God you're safe. I have been trying to find you for months." He ushered her into his private office, a space dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city, and once the door was closed, he turned to face her with an intensity that made her want to step backward. "I was Daniel's personal attorney," he said without preamble, gesturing for her to sit in one of the leather chairs that faced his massive desk. "He hired me 5 years ago, shortly after you met, though he swore me to absolute secrecy. Everything I did for him was confidential, protected by attorney-client privilege, and he made it very clear that you were never to know about our arrangement unless something happened to him." He was preparing for this moment, Mrs. Morrison, preparing for the day when he would be gone and you would need protection from dangers he could only partially explain, even to me. Claire sank into the chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight, and Patterson moved to his desk, pulling out a thick file that he set before him like evidence in a trial. "I need you to understand something," he continued, leaning forward with his hands clasped on the desk. "What Daniel set in motion, what he tried to protect you from, it's bigger and more dangerous than anything you can imagine right now. But before I can tell you the full story, before I can show you the legal protections he put in place, I need you to retrieve the contents of that safety deposit box." He was very specific about this. "The evidence has to be in your possession, in your control, before we proceed." He opened a drawer and produced a letter on firm letterhead, already prepared and notarized, authorizing Claire to access Box 347 at First National Bank. "This will get you into the vault," he said, sliding it across the desk. "But Mrs. Morrison, Claire, you need to be very careful. The people who are looking for you, the people who have been watching you, they know about that box. They have been trying to access it for months, but the bank has very specific instructions from Daniel that only you or your legal representative can enter it. Go directly there, take only what is inside, and come directly back here. Do not stop, do not speak to anyone, do not let anyone follow you. What is in that box is the key to everything, your safety, your children's future, and the destruction of very powerful people who will stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried." First National Bank was a grand old building in downtown Nashville, all marble columns and brass fixtures that spoke of an era when banks were temples of commerce and trust. And Claire climbed its wide stone steps with Patterson's authorization letter clutched in one hand and the brass key in the other, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The interior was cool and hushed, voices echoing softly off the high ceiling, and when she approached the desk marked customer service, a young man in his late 20s looked up and his expression shifted immediately from professional welcome to something that looked almost like alarm. He read the authorization letter twice, checked the key against some list on his computer screen, and his hands trembled slightly as he picked up the phone and made a call in a voice too low for Claire to hear. Within moments, an older man appeared, introducing himself as the assistant manager, and he escorted the young clerk away with a firm hand on his shoulder and a whispered conversation that looked intense and worried, before returning to Claire with a smile that did not reach his nervous eyes. "I'll take you to the vault personally, Mrs. Morrison," he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested this was not standard procedure but rather a deviation born of circumstances she did not understand. He led her through a heavy door and down a corridor lined with more brass and marble, and as they walked, she could feel his anxiety like a living thing, could see the way his eyes darted to the corners where security cameras watched their progress, could sense that he was rushing her along with a haste that had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with fear. The vault was a massive steel door that looked like it belonged in a movie, and inside the air was climate-controlled and sterile. Rows upon rows of metal boxes lining the walls like tiny coffins holding the secrets of the wealthy and the careful. Box 347 was in the middle row, and the manager used her key and his master key to open it, sliding out a long metal container that he carried to a small private room lined with wood paneling and containing only a table and 2 chairs. "Take all the time you need," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite, that she should hurry, that danger pressed close like a storm about to break. Claire waited until he closed the door, leaving her alone in the small room with its single overhead light, and with hands that shook so badly she had to steady them against the table, she opened the box. Inside were layers of Daniel's secrets, each item a piece of the puzzle he had died protecting. Multiple sealed envelopes, each one labeled in his careful handwriting with words like evidence, financial records, personal testimony. A thick folder bound with rubber bands, so stuffed with documents that pages threatened to spill out. A small USB drive in a plastic case. And nestled among all of this, a small velvet jewelry box that looked old and expensive, the kind that might hold an engagement ring or a precious heirloom. Claire's instinct was to open everything immediately, to read and examine and finally understand. But the manager's anxiety had infected her, and she could feel the weight of watching eyes even through the vault's thick walls. She swept everything into her large purse, cramming the envelopes and folder and tiny boxes inside until the bag bulged and threatened to tear. And when she emerged from the private room, the manager was waiting right outside as if he had been standing guard. He rushed her through the vault door, through the corridor, back into the main banking floor, and as they approached the exit, he leaned close and whispered with genuine fear, coloring his voice. "Be very careful, Mrs. Morrison. There have been people asking about this box, powerful people making threats. I was told to call a certain number if you ever showed up, but I'm not going to do it. Your husband was insistent that only you should access this box, and I'm honoring that. But you need to leave now and not come back." Claire burst through the bank's heavy doors into the cold afternoon air, and immediately her eyes found what she had been dreading, the black sedan parked across the street, its dark windows reflecting the gray sky like mirrors that revealed nothing. Her heart lurched, and her first instinct was to run, but she forced herself to walk normally, to blend into the lunch crowd moving along the sidewalk. And when she reached the corner, she ducked into a large shopping mall, its multiple entrances and crowds offering the cover she desperately needed. She wove through department stores and food courts, doubled back through service corridors, and when she finally emerged from a side entrance 20 minutes later, the black sedan was nowhere in sight. And she allowed herself one shaking breath of relief before hurrying toward the bus station, Patterson's office, and the revelations that waited in the items now weighing down her purse like stones of truth too heavy to carry but too precious to abandon. Patterson's office felt different when Claire returned, the afternoon sun slanting through the tall windows, casting long shadows that seemed to underscore the gravity of what was about to be revealed. And the lawyer stood when she entered, his face tight with concern until he saw that she carried her bulging purse and was unharmed. He locked the office door, pulled the blinds closed despite the beauty of the view, and gestured for her to empty the contents of the box onto his desk. And as Claire did so, watching the envelopes and folders and tiny boxes spill across the polished wood surface, she saw Patterson's hands begin to tremble in a way that frightened her, because men like him, men of law and power and controlled professional demeanor, did not tremble without cause. He opened the first envelope with careful precision, unfolding documents that he scanned with eyes that grew wider with each page, and then he opened another and another, his breath coming faster, his face cycling through expressions of shock and anger and something that looked almost like vindication, as if pieces of a story he had only partially understood were finally completing themselves into a terrible whole. When he finally looked up at Claire, his voice was hoarse with emotion he was struggling to contain. "Your husband's real name," he said slowly, each word weighted with significance, "was Daniel Ashworth, not Daniel Morrison. That was an identity he created 5 years ago when he fled from his family and went into hiding." The name Ashworth exploded in Claire's mind with sudden recognition, because even someone who lived as simply as she had could not avoid knowing that name, could not escape the awareness that Ashworth Industrial was one of the largest manufacturing conglomerates in the country, a family empire built over 3 generations that touched everything from aerospace to medical equipment, a name synonymous with wealth and power on a scale that ordinary people could barely comprehend. Patterson continued, his hands now spreading documents across the desk in a pattern that told a story, a timeline of betrayal and protection and desperate planning. Daniel's grandfather, William Ashworth, died 5 months before Daniel did. William was the founder of the company, a self-made man who built the Ashworth fortune from nothing, and in his final years he discovered something terrible about his own family. This, he tapped a thick legal document bound in blue covers, is William's last will and testament, and it is extraordinary in its specificity and its cruelty towards certain family members. William left his entire personal estate, valued at approximately $75 million, directly to Daniel, bypassing Daniel's mother Victoria entirely, cutting her out completely along with Daniel's brother Marcus. Patterson pulled out another document, and Claire could see it was a letter in an elderly hand, shaking but determined. William knew his family, knew what they were capable of, and he included a provision that Daniel likely did not live long enough to trigger. The will states explicitly that if Daniel died before claiming the inheritance, it would pass entirely to Daniel's spouse and children, again bypassing Victoria and Marcus completely. William was protecting his great-grandchildren from the poison he recognized in his own bloodline. The lawyer's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and Claire had to lean forward to hear him over the ringing in her own ears. Daniel knew they would kill him for this money. He told me so directly. He said his mother was capable of murder, that she had probably killed his father years ago, though it was ruled an accident, and that when William changed his will, Daniel's life became forfeit, so he ran. He changed his name, moved to a small town, built a quiet life, and tried to disappear. But the cancer found him anyway, and when he got sick, when he knew he was dying, he had to make preparations to protect you and the children, because the inheritance would pass to you automatically upon his death. Patterson opened the blue-bound will and turned it so Claire could see, his finger pointing to her name, Claire Morrison, also known as Claire Ashworth, spouse of Daniel Ashworth, and below it the phrase, "and any children born of this union." And the numbers that followed were so large they seemed abstract, meaningless. $75 million held in trust, properties, stocks, assets that would make her one of the wealthiest women in Tennessee. Victoria has been trying to find this will and destroy it, Patterson said, his voice now hard with anger. She has been searching for you, hunting you, because as long as you exist and this will exists, she gets nothing. And Daniel made sure of that, because he knew exactly what his mother was and what she would do to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. Patterson rose from his chair and moved to the window, his back to Claire for a moment as if gathering strength for what he needed to say next. And when he turned back, his face was grave in a way that transcended professional concern and touched something more personal, something that looked almost like hatred for the people whose actions he was about to describe. "I need you to understand exactly who Victoria Ashworth is," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of testimony, of laying out facts in a case he had been building for years. She was not born into wealth. She married Daniel's father, Richard Ashworth, 35 years ago, a beautiful, ambitious woman from nothing, who saw in Richard a path to everything she had ever wanted, and once she had access to the Ashworth fortune, she became something monstrous. Richard died 22 years ago in what was ruled an accidental fall down the stairs of their estate, a tragic incident that left Victoria a wealthy widow with complete control over her young sons. But William never believed it was an accident. He spent years quietly investigating, gathering evidence that his daughter-in-law had orchestrated his son's death, but he could never prove it conclusively enough to bring criminal charges, and so he watched and waited and planned his revenge in the only way left to him, through his will. Patterson returned to his desk and pulled out a folder filled with photographs, newspaper clippings, and what looked like private investigator reports. Marcus, Daniel's younger brother, is Victoria's creature entirely. Daniel told me that Marcus witnessed their father's death, saw something that traumatized him so deeply he became completely psychologically dependent on Victoria, unable to function without her direction, terrified of her displeasure. She has used him as her puppet for decades, and he does whatever she commands without question or conscience. When William Ashworth finally understood the full scope of Victoria's nature, when he realized that the woman his son had married was a calculating killer who had destroyed his own child for money, he made a decision that would have consequences beyond anything he could have predicted. He changed his will completely, cutting Victoria and Marcus out entirely, leaving everything to Daniel because Daniel was the only one who had shown the strength to resist her influence, the only one who had maintained some core of decency despite being raised in that poisonous environment. Claire listened in horror as Patterson described how Daniel had lived under Victoria's roof until he was 25, how he had watched his mother's cruelty and manipulation, how he had finally understood that she had killed his father, and that he would be next if he ever stood between her and complete control of the family fortune. When William told Daniel about the will change 6 years ago, Daniel knew immediately that his life was in danger. Victoria would never allow $75 million to pass to someone she could not control. So Daniel did the only thing he could do. He disappeared. He legally changed his name. moved to a town small enough that no one would recognize the Ashworth heir, took a job as a bookstore manager, and built a life so deliberately ordinary that it would never attract the attention of the world he had fled. He met you, fell in love, married you under his new name, and for 3 years he had the peace he had never known as an Ashworth. But the cancer came, and with it the knowledge that he was dying, and he had to prepare for what would happen when Victoria inevitably discovered that he had left behind a wife and children who would inherit everything she believed was hers by right. Patterson's voice grew harder, colder, as he described the present threat. Victoria has been searching for Daniel's heir for months. She initially did not know he had married or had children because Daniel was so careful to keep that life separate from his former identity. But eventually her investigators found the connection. The eviction, Claire, was not random cruelty from a grieving mother-in-law. It was deliberate psychological warfare. Victoria discovered your identity and positioned herself perfectly, playing the role of Daniel's grieving mother, attending his funeral, meeting you and Emma, gaining your trust just enough to know where you lived and what resources you had, and then she struck. She threw you out to destabilize you, to make you desperate and vulnerable, to ensure that when she moved to claim the inheritance and challenge the will, you would be in no position to fight back. You would appear to be exactly what she would paint you as in court, an unstable opportunist who had trapped her son and was now trying to steal money you had no right to claim. Patterson moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew another folder, this one markedly thinner but somehow more ominous in its simplicity. And when he opened it, Claire saw legal documents stamped with court seals and official signatures that looked like weapons made of paper. "Victoria has not been idle while searching for you," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. 3 weeks ago, she filed a petition with the Tennessee family court system, claiming that you abandoned Daniel during his illness, that you suffer from mental instability and substance abuse issues, and that you are fundamentally unfit to raise children or manage any inheritance that might pass to them. She is building a case, Claire, a carefully constructed narrative in which she is the concerned grandmother trying to protect her vulnerable grandchildren from their mother's neglect and incompetence. And she has manufactured evidence to support every claim. False testimonies from people she has paid, doctored records from the time of Daniel's illness, even psychiatric evaluations from doctors who never met you, but were willing to sign documents suggesting you pose a danger to yourself and your children. The words hit Claire like physical blows, each revelation more stunning than the last, and she felt the room tilting around her as if the floor had become unstable beneath her feet. Patterson continued relentlessly, laying out the full scope of Victoria's attack with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. She is preparing to file for emergency custody of Emma and for guardianship of your unborn child the moment he or she is born. Her argument will be that these children are Ashworth heirs, that they require the protection and resources only their family can provide, that allowing them to remain with you condemns them to poverty and instability when they could have every advantage the Ashworth name can offer. It is a compelling argument on the surface, especially when presented by a woman of Victoria's wealth and social standing, and judges are often sympathetic to grandparents seeking to protect children from struggling single mothers. Claire found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "The photograph," she said, remembering the defaced image Emma had been given, and Patterson nodded grimly. "Psychological warfare," he confirmed. "Victoria gave that to Emma deliberately, knowing the child would carry it with her, knowing you would eventually find it and be disturbed by it. The person whose face was scratched out was Daniel himself. Victoria symbolically erased her own son from the family portrait, sending you a message that she has the power to erase him from history, to control the narrative of who he was and what he meant, and by extension to erase you and take your children. Everything she does is calculated for maximum psychological impact, designed to make you feel powerless and alone, to convince you that fighting her is futile because she controls everything: the courts, the lawyers, the narrative, the truth itself." Patterson leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk, and his eyes held an intensity that demanded Claire's full attention despite the shock that was threatening to shut down her ability to process information. "We have to fight back immediately," he said with urgent force. "We have Daniel's evidence, his testimony recorded on that USB drive, William's will that explicitly names you as beneficiary, and documentation of Victoria's crimes that William spent years compiling. We file counterclaims. We present everything to the court. We expose Victoria for exactly what she is, a murderer and a manipulator who is trying to steal an inheritance that legally belongs to you and your children. But Claire, you need to understand what this means. The moment we file these documents, the moment we go public with these accusations, you become a direct threat to Victoria, and she will escalate. That black sedan following you is not just surveillance to track your movements. It is intimidation designed to keep you afraid and compliant. And when you stop being afraid and start being dangerous to her interests, she will move from intimidation to something far worse, and we need to prepare for that reality before we take the first step. The bus ride back from Nashville felt different than the morning journey, as if Claire herself had been transformed by the revelations that now sat heavy in her purse alongside the weight of $75 million in inheritance documents, and where before she had felt small and vulnerable. She now felt something else stirring beneath the fear, something that tasted like anger and determination, and the fierce protective instinct of a mother who finally understood exactly what threatened her children. Margaret was waiting when Claire climbed the stairs to the apartment, Emma coloring peacefully at one of the diner's tables under Margaret's watchful eye. And when the older woman saw Claire's face, she knew immediately that something fundamental had shifted, that the frightened woman who had left that morning had returned as someone harder, someone ready to fight. Claire asked if they could speak privately, and Margaret closed the diner early, an unprecedented action that spoke to the seriousness she read in Claire's demeanor, and then she called Mr. Watkins down from his room, and the three of them sat together in the apartment's small kitchen while Claire spread the documents across the table like evidence in a trial and told them everything. She told them about Daniel's true identity, about the Ashworth fortune, about Victoria's murderous history and her current campaign to destroy Claire and take the children. And as she spoke, she watched both of their faces transform from shock to understanding to a hardening resolve that matched her own. Mr. Watkins picked up one of the documents, a private investigator's report about Victoria's activities, and his old hands that had trembled slightly with age now steadied as he read with the focus of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. And when he finally set it down, his voice carried a gravity that commanded absolute attention. "I need to tell you something I should have mentioned before," he said, meeting Claire's eyes directly. "I was not just a postal worker before I retired. That was my second career, the quiet one I took after 30 years as a criminal investigator with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. I know how to read threat assessments, Claire, and I know how to spot professionals when they are conducting surveillance, and everything I have seen over the past weeks tells me that Victoria Ashworth has hired serious people to track and intimidate you, the kind of people who do not stop unless they are made to stop through legal force or the threat of exposure." Margaret, who had been silent until now, reached across the table and gripped Claire's hand with surprising strength. And her voice when she spoke was thick with emotion, but absolutely firm in its conviction. "My late husband Tom was a defense attorney before he died," she said. "I sat through enough trials and strategy sessions to understand how these battles are fought, and I know that women like Victoria count on their victims being isolated and too afraid to fight back. You are not isolated, Claire. You have us, and we will stand with you through whatever comes, testimony in court if needed, safe harbor when you need it. Witnesses to the truth that Victoria cannot intimidate or buy off because we have nothing she can take from us that matters more than doing what is right." The alliance that formed in that small kitchen felt like something solid and real, a foundation upon which Claire could finally stand and fight. And over the next hours they made plans with the methodical care of people preparing for war. Mr. Watkins would use his old contacts in law enforcement to gather additional information about the men in the black sedan, to document the surveillance and build a case for harassment and intimidation. Margaret would provide employment records and character testimony, proof that Claire was stable and capable, and nothing like the narrative Victoria was constructing. Patterson, when Claire called him that evening, moved with the speed of someone who had been preparing for this moment, filing emergency protective orders that would legally bar Victoria from approaching Claire or Emma, custody declarations that established Claire's parental rights and challenged any attempt Victoria might make to claim the children, and motions to present William Ashworth's will to probate court along with all the evidence of Victoria's crimes. The USB drive sat on the kitchen table throughout these discussions, a small black rectangle that contained what Patterson had described as Daniel's final testimony. And when night had fallen and Emma was asleep and Mr. Watkins and Margaret had returned to their own spaces, Claire finally inserted it into her old laptop and pressed play. Daniel's face filled the screen, gaunt from illness, but his eyes bright with desperate purpose, and his voice when he spoke carried across the months that separated his recording from her watching. "My darling Claire," he began, and she had to pause the video because tears blurred her vision and her chest felt too tight to breathe. "If you are watching this, then I am gone and you have discovered the truth I could not bring myself to tell you while I lived. My name is Daniel Ashworth, and I come from a family that destroyed my father, that poisoned my childhood, and that will try to destroy you and our children if given the chance. My mother Victoria killed my father for his money when I was 13 years old. I saw things, knew things, but I was too young and too afraid to speak, and my silence made me complicit in his murder. When my grandfather William discovered the truth years later, he changed his will to protect me and to punish Victoria by cutting her out of the inheritance she had killed to secure. I fled because I knew she would kill me too, rather than let me claim what William left to me, and I found you, and you gave me 3 years of being human instead of an Ashworth, 3 years of peace and love and normalcy I had never known existed. I am leaving you everything, not just money but the evidence to protect yourself, the truth that can destroy Victoria if you are brave enough to wield it, and my absolute faith that you are stronger than you know, that you will fight for our children with a ferocity my mother cannot match, because your love is real and hers is poison, and love, true love, always wins in the end." Victoria Ashworth arrived at Margaret's diner on a Tuesday afternoon like a storm made flesh. 3 black luxury sedans pulling up to the curb in synchronized precision that spoke of rehearsed choreography, and Claire, who was refilling coffee for the lunch crowd, felt every muscle in her body lock into place as she watched through the window. Victoria emerged from the center vehicle, and even from a distance Claire could see that this was a woman who wielded her appearance like a weapon, elegant in the way that only extreme wealth could purchase. Dressed in a black suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, her silver hair styled in a perfect chignon, her bearing radiating the kind of cold, imperious authority that assumed obedience as her natural due. Behind her came Marcus, and seeing Daniel's brother for the first time was like looking at a ghost, because he shared Daniel's height and basic features, but where Daniel had possessed warmth and kindness, Marcus's face was a mask of weakness and barely concealed fear, his eyes darting constantly to his mother, as if seeking permission for every breath, every movement. 4 lawyers in matching dark suits flanked them, briefcases in hand, and the small procession moved toward the diner's entrance with the inevitability of an execution party approaching the gallows. The bell above the door chimed, incongruously cheerful, and suddenly the diner that had been filled with the ordinary sounds of conversation and clinking silverware fell silent as Victoria Ashworth stood in the doorway and surveyed the room with eyes that were the exact pale blue of winter. Ice, beautiful and absolutely devoid of warmth. Her gaze found Claire immediately, locked onto her with an intensity that felt like being pinned by a predator, and when she spoke her voice carried the cultivated accent of old money and finishing schools. Smooth as silk and just as capable of strangling. "I am here to see my granddaughter Emma," she announced, not asking but declaring, as if her desire alone constituted both permission and command. "I have been denied access to my late son's child for far too long, and I am exercising my rights as her grandmother to establish a relationship that has been maliciously withheld from me." Margaret, who had been wiping down the counter, moved with surprising speed to position herself between Victoria and the door that led to the back room where Emma was playing, and her voice when she responded was flat and unyielding as stone. "You have no rights here, and you're not seeing that child without her mother's permission, which I'm guessing you don't have." Victoria's perfect composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of rage crossing her face before she smoothed it back into controlled civility, and one of the lawyers stepped forward with officious importance to inform Margaret that they would call the police if she continued to obstruct their client's lawful request. Margaret's response was to pull out her own phone and dial, her eyes never leaving Victoria's face, as she calmly reported to the dispatcher that she had unwanted individuals in her establishment, refusing to leave, and threatening her and her customers. Claire found her legs finally working again and moved to stand beside Margaret, and as she did, Victoria's attention shifted fully to her, and the naked hatred in that gaze was so pure, so absolute, that it felt like a physical force trying to push Claire backward. The police arrived within minutes, 2 officers who listened to both sides and ultimately informed Victoria that without a court order granting her visitation rights, she had no legal standing to demand access to the child, and perhaps it would be best if she left and pursued this matter through proper legal channels. Victoria's face remained a mask of wounded dignity, playing the role of grieving grandmother denied access to her beloved grandchild with such perfect conviction that even the officers looked sympathetic. And as she turned to leave, one of her lawyers approached Claire and pressed a folded document into her hands. "Custody hearing, 2 weeks from today," he said with professional detachment. "You are required to appear." Then, Victoria herself stepped close, so close that Claire could smell her expensive perfume, could see the fine lines that no amount of money could completely erase from around those cold eyes, and she leaned in to whisper directly into Claire's ear, her voice dropping to a hiss that only the two of them could hear. "You are nothing. A waitress with a bastard child playing dress-up in my son's life. You will never see a penny of that money, and I will make absolutely certain that your children grow up knowing their mother was a thief who tried to steal what was never hers." Claire felt something snap inside her. Not breaking, but rather hardening, crystallizing into a core of steel she had not known she possessed, and when she spoke her voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the now silent diner. "Daniel loved me, and he knew what you are." Patterson worked through the night following Victoria's public confrontation at the diner, and when Claire arrived at his office the next morning, he looked exhausted but energized in the way that soldiers must feel before a decisive battle. Surrounded by documents spread across every surface like a paper fortress built from evidence and truth, he had spent hours examining every item from the safety deposit box, and what he found was nothing less than a complete roadmap to Victoria Ashworth's destruction. A carefully compiled archive of criminality that William Ashworth had assembled with the methodical patience of a man who knew he was running out of time but refused to die without ensuring justice. The bank records alone were devastating, showing a pattern of embezzlement stretching back 15 years. Victoria systematically siphoning money from Ashworth Industrial through shell companies and false invoices, amounts that individually seemed small enough to escape notice but cumulatively totaled nearly $8 million stolen from the company her husband had built and her father-in-law had founded. The private investigator reports were even more damning. 3 separate investigations William had commissioned that all reached the same conclusion, that Richard Ashworth's death had been no accident, but rather a carefully staged murder, with testimony from a housemaid who had seen Victoria and Richard arguing violently at the top of the stairs minutes before his fall, with analysis from a forensic consultant who identified inconsistencies in the police report that suggested the scene had been manipulated, with financial records showing Victoria had taken out a massive life insurance policy on Richard just 6 months before his death. But the most chilling evidence came from recorded conversations, audio files that Daniel had apparently captured during his final months living in the Ashworth mansion before he fled. Conversations where Victoria spoke with cold calculation about her sons and their usefulness to her plans, where she discussed with Marcus the problem that Daniel represented and various solutions that might be employed, where she explicitly stated that if Daniel ever tried to claim his grandfather's inheritance, she would eliminate him the same way she had eliminated his father, because money was the only thing that mattered, and family was just another word for leverage. Patterson explained to Claire that this evidence transformed the case from a simple inheritance dispute into something far more serious. That if they presented this material in court, Victoria would not merely lose the custody battle and the inheritance, she would face criminal indictment for murder, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, charges that could send her to prison for the rest of her life. But this reality, Patterson stressed with urgent gravity, made Victoria exponentially more dangerous, because a woman facing life imprisonment had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by eliminating the witnesses who could destroy her. And Claire needed to understand that from this moment forward, she was not just fighting for her children's inheritance, but for their very survival against a woman who had already killed once and would not hesitate to kill again if it meant preserving her freedom and her fortune. The feeling of being watched had intensified over the past 3 days, a crawling sensation on the back of Claire's neck that never quite disappeared. And on Thursday evening, when shadows seemed to press too close against the windows of the apartment and every creak of the old building sounded like footsteps on the stairs, she made a decision that probably saved their lives. She packed an overnight bag for herself and Emma, told her daughter they were having a special sleepover at Mr. Watkins' place, and the old man welcomed them without question, reading the fear in Claire's eyes and understanding immediately that her instincts were screaming warnings that should not be ignored. They settled Emma on his couch with blankets and pillows, and Mr. Watkins made hot chocolate while Claire tried to calm the racing of her heart, tried to convince herself that she was being paranoid, that Victoria would not be bold enough to escalate beyond legal intimidation. She was wrong. The call came at 2 in the morning, Margaret's voice tight with shock, telling them that someone had broken into the apartment, that she had heard crashing sounds and called the police, that whoever had been up there was gone by the time officers arrived, but the destruction they left behind was total and deliberate. Claire and Mr. Watkins rushed down the back stairs, leaving Emma sleeping under Margaret's protective watch. And when Claire stepped through the door of what had been her home, she felt as if she had walked into the aftermath of a tornado designed specifically to destroy hope. Every drawer had been pulled out and dumped, their contents scattered across the floor like the debris of a life torn apart. The mattress was slashed open, stuffing spilling out like guts from a gutted animal. Emma's few toys were smashed, her drawings torn into confetti that covered the floor like snow. The closet had been ransacked, clothes thrown everywhere, and even the kitchen cabinets hung open, their sparse contents swept onto the counters in a frenzy of searching. The police took statements and photographs, their faces showing the professional sympathy of officers who had seen too many break-ins to be surprised by the cruelty humans inflicted on each other. But they offered little hope of finding whoever was responsible, noting that there were no signs of forced entry and no fingerprints that would be useful for identification. After they left, Mr. Watkins moved through the apartment with the careful attention of someone trained to read crime scenes, and he knelt suddenly near the bedroom doorway, pulling reading glasses from his pocket to examine something on the floor, a partial footprint in what looked like drywall dust, the tread pattern clear and distinctive, and Mr. Watkins pulled out his phone to photograph it from multiple angles before showing Claire. The pattern matched an expensive tactical boot brand, the kind worn by professional security personnel, and near the window he found a single dark fiber caught on a nail, the kind that came from corporate security uniforms. This was not some random burglar looking for valuables to pawn. This was a professional search conducted by people who knew exactly what they were looking for. And Claire understood with cold certainty that Victoria had sent her people to find the documents from the safety deposit box, to destroy the evidence that could send her to prison, and the only reason Claire and Emma were not hurt was because they had not been there to interfere with the search. And the thought of what might have happened if they had been sleeping in that apartment when Victoria's people arrived made Claire's legs weak and her stomach turn. But there was bitter victory in this violence, because Victoria's desperation revealed her ignorance. She did not know that Claire had already given everything to Patterson, that the evidence was beyond her reach, safely locked in a lawyer's vault and backed up in multiple locations. And this attack, this violation of Claire's home, was nothing more than the thrashing of a predator who sensed the trap closing around her but could not see the bars of the cage until it was too late. The break-in shattered something inside Claire, but what emerged from those broken pieces was not weakness, but rather a core of steel that had been there all along, hidden beneath layers of grief and fear, and the learned helplessness of a woman who had been taught by circumstance to believe she had no power. The fear that had been her constant companion since Victoria's door slammed shut transformed first into anger, white-hot and clarifying, and then into something even more powerful, a determination so absolute it felt like a physical force reshaping her from the inside out. She was no longer the frightened woman who had spent that first night shivering in a car with her daughter, no longer the desperate soul begging for work at businesses that turned her away, no longer the victim of Victoria's psychological warfare, who jumped at shadows and second-guessed every decision. She was a mother protecting her children with the fierce, single-minded purpose of a lioness defending her cubs, and she was a widow honoring her husband's sacrifice by refusing to let his murderous family destroy what he had died trying to preserve. Patterson noticed the change during their next strategy session, the way Claire no longer sat passively listening but instead leaned forward asking sharp, incisive questions about legal precedents and courtroom procedures, anticipating Victoria's likely moves with an intuition that surprised him, challenging his assumptions and offering perspectives he had not considered. She requested copies of all the legal documents and spent her nights after Emma fell asleep studying them with the intensity of a student preparing for the most important examination of her life, learning the language of law and inheritance and custody battles until she could discuss the case with the fluency of someone who understood not just the surface facts but the deeper strategies at play. Mr. Watkins, seeing this transformation and recognizing the warrior emerging from the shell of the frightened woman, began teaching her the basics of situational awareness, how to recognize when someone was following her, how to vary her routines to avoid predictable patterns, how to assess exits and threats in any environment, and he showed her simple self-defense techniques that would give her a fighting chance if Victoria's people ever cornered her, teaching her that the best defense was the willingness to fight back with everything she had because predators preferred easy victims and she would never be easy again. Margaret worked with her on projection, on carrying herself with confidence even when fear still lurked beneath the surface, teaching her that power was as much about how you presented yourself as what you actually possessed, helping her choose words and postures that communicated strength rather than vulnerability. Emma noticed the change most of all, her 8-year-old eyes watching as her mother transformed from someone who cried quietly at night into someone who stood straighter, spoke more firmly, and met the world with a gaze that did not flinch. And one morning, as Claire was getting ready for another meeting with Patterson, Emma hugged her tight and whispered with perfect childhood certainty, "You look like a superhero now, Mommy." And Claire realized that perhaps she had finally become the person Daniel had always believed she could be. The courtroom of the Davidson County Family Court was a chamber designed for the resolution of domestic disputes, its wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting creating an atmosphere that was meant to feel orderly and neutral, but instead felt oppressive and charged with the kind of tension that precedes violent storms. Victoria Ashworth arrived surrounded by her legal team like a queen attended by courtiers. 6 lawyers in expensive suits carrying briefcases that probably cost more than most people made in a month, and she was dressed entirely in black, as if attending a funeral, the effect carefully calculated to present the image of a grieving mother and grandmother whose family had been torn apart by tragedy. Claire sat at the plaintiff's table with Patterson beside her, and she forced herself to breathe steadily, to maintain the calm exterior that hid the churning terror beneath, because she knew that this hearing would determine not just custody of Emma, but the entire trajectory of their lives, whether they would survive Victoria's assault or be destroyed by it. The judge was a woman in her late 50s named Catherine Reynolds, her face a professional mask of neutrality as she reviewed the case files, and when she called the hearing to order, the packed gallery fell silent with the hushed anticipation of spectators watching gladiators enter the arena. Victoria took the stand first, and her performance was Oscar-worthy, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face as she spoke in a voice that trembled with perfectly calibrated emotion about her troubled son Daniel, who had always struggled with mental health issues, who had fallen under the influence of a woman far beneath his station, who had been isolated from his loving family by a manipulative opportunist who saw only dollar signs where there should have been genuine affection. Her lawyers built on this foundation with ruthless efficiency, presenting their false narrative of Claire as a waitress who had deliberately trapped a vulnerable man, who had kept him away from his family during his illness, who had refused to allow his mother even to attend his funeral despite Victoria's desperate attempts to reconcile, and who was now fabricating outrageous claims about murder and embezzlement in a transparent attempt to steal an inheritance she had no legitimate claim to. Claire sat listening to herself being systematically destroyed, character assassination conducted with the precision of surgeons using scalpels made of lies, and she felt her hands clenching beneath the table, until Patterson touched her arm gently and whispered that it was almost time. When Victoria's side finally rested, confident in the narrative they had constructed, Patterson stood, and his voice when he spoke carried a gravity that made even Victoria's expensive lawyers pause. "Your Honor, the defense would like to present testimony from Daniel Ashworth himself," he said, and the courtroom erupted in confused murmurs because everyone knew Daniel was dead. Patterson moved to set up a laptop connected to the courtroom's display screen, and as the lights dimmed and Daniel's face appeared, gaunt from cancer but his eyes blazing with desperate purpose, the room fell into a silence so profound that Claire could hear her own heartbeat. Daniel spoke directly to the camera, and therefore directly to everyone watching, his voice steady despite his obvious physical suffering, as he explained his true identity as heir to the Ashworth fortune, as he detailed his childhood in a house poisoned by his mother's manipulation and cruelty, as he described witnessing things that no child should see, and carrying secrets that nearly destroyed him. He spoke of his father's death that was no accident, of Victoria's systematic destruction of anyone who stood between her and complete control of the family wealth, and then his voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout as he looked directly into the camera and said with absolute certainty, "My mother Victoria Ashworth murdered my father Richard Ashworth 22 years ago, and she would have murdered me too if I had not fled. And now she will try to take my children from the woman I love because that is what she does. She destroys everything beautiful and claims it was always hers by right. The judge's expression, which had been carefully neutral throughout Victoria's testimony, hardened into something that looked like granite, and across the courtroom Victoria's perfect composure finally cracked, her face contorting with rage she could no longer contain, as she half rose from her seat before her lawyers pulled her back down, their own faces showing the panic of people who had just watched their carefully constructed case collapse into rubble around them. Patterson moved through the evidence with methodical precision, first presenting bank records showing Victoria's embezzlement spanning 15 years, then the private investigator reports that laid out the case for murder with forensic clarity, and finally William Ashworth's personal journal, his handwriting shaky with age but the words burning with rage, as he detailed discovering his daughter-in-law had murdered his son and his decision to cut her from his will entirely, protecting Daniel and any children he might have. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer blow, and Claire watched the faces in the courtroom transform from skepticism to shock to disgust. But the most devastating moment came when Patterson called Marcus Ashworth for cross-examination, and the younger man began to unravel under questioning that was surgical in its precision. Patterson asked simple, direct questions Marcus could not dodge. Did he witness his father's death? What exactly did he see? And Marcus's answers came in broken fragments. Yes, he had been there. Yes, he had seen his mother and father arguing at the top of the stairs. Yes, his father had fallen, but not before his mother pushed him. And finally, in a whisper that carried to every corner of the stunned courtroom. Yes, he had known all along his mother was a murderer, but said nothing because he was terrified she would destroy him too. The courtroom erupted and Victoria's attorney stood to request recess, but Judge Reynolds denied it with a sharp gavel crack, her face showing barely controlled fury. Victoria herself demanded to take the stand, overruling her lawyers' frantic protests, and under Patterson's questioning her mask fell away entirely to reveal the monster beneath, and she spoke with naked contempt about Claire as a gold-digging waitress, about Daniel as a weak, disappointing son, about William as a senile fool who had no right to give away money Victoria had earned through decades managing the Ashworth image. And when Patterson asked if she felt remorse for her husband's death, she laughed and said Richard had been planning to divorce her, and she had simply done what was necessary to secure what was rightfully hers. And did anyone really believe morality mattered more than survival? And by the time Patterson finished, Victoria sat exposed as exactly what Daniel had called her. A murderer consumed by greed who had terrorized her sons and was trying to steal children from their mother. The hearing adjourned with Judge Reynolds announcing she would render her decision within 24 hours, but that preliminary protective orders were being issued immediately. And as Claire walked through the courthouse corridors toward the exit, she felt simultaneously triumphant and hollowed out, the adrenaline that had sustained her through hours of testimony now draining away and leaving exhaustion in its wake. The parking garage was dim and echoing, their footsteps loud against concrete, and Claire was halfway to Patterson's car when she heard the sharp click of expensive heels and turned to find Victoria Ashworth approaching alone, her legal team nowhere in sight, and the elegant facade that had cracked on the witness stand was now completely shattered to reveal something feral and desperate beneath. Victoria's face was contorted with rage that made her unrecognizable as the composed society matron who had arrived that morning, and her voice when she spoke was a hiss of pure venom. "You have ruined everything, you worthless little thief, and I will destroy you for this. I will make sure your children suffer every day of their miserable lives. I will hunt you until the day I die." Mr. Watkins, who had been following at a protective distance, pulled out his phone and began recording, and when Victoria noticed the camera, her rage exploded into physical action and she lunged toward Claire with hands extended like claws. Security guards appeared from nowhere, restraining Victoria as she screamed threats that echoed through the garage, her composure completely gone, replaced by the raw hatred of someone watching their entire world collapse. The video Mr. Watkins captured showed everything: Victoria's threats, her physical attack, her complete loss of control, and within hours it was submitted to Judge Reynolds, along with emergency motions. And by evening, Victoria Ashworth was in police custody facing charges of attempted assault, witness intimidation, conspiracy to commit murder, and the decades-old murder of Richard Ashworth, while Claire stood in Patterson's office watching through the window as squad cars surrounded the Ashworth estate, finally safe, finally vindicated, finally free. 3 weeks of waiting felt like an eternity compressed into sleepless nights and anxious days. But when Judge Reynolds finally issued her ruling, the words were so definitive, so absolute in their clarity, that Claire felt years of fear lifting from her shoulders like chains being struck away. Full custody of Emma granted to Claire Morrison with no visitation rights for Victoria Ashworth. Permanent restraining orders issued protecting both children from any contact with Victoria or her agents, and the complete transfer of the Ashworth inheritance to Claire as trustee for her children, exactly as William Ashworth's will had specified, and Daniel had desperately hoped. Victoria's indictment came the same day. Formal charges of first-degree murder in Richard Ashworth's death, multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud, witness intimidation and conspiracy. The district attorney announcing at a press conference that they were pursuing the maximum sentence for a woman whose crimes had poisoned an entire family for decades. Marcus, broken and weeping, accepted a plea deal that gave him 5 years for accessory after the fact in exchange for his testimony. And Claire felt no satisfaction in his destruction, because he had been as much Victoria's victim as anyone, a child traumatized into compliance who had never found the strength Daniel possessed to escape. Patterson worked with financial advisors and security consultants to transform the abstract numbers of $75 million into concrete protections, establishing trusts that would fund Emma's education and the new baby's future, purchasing a home in a safe neighborhood with actual security systems, ensuring that Claire would never again know the terror of counting her last $7 or sleeping in a car or wondering how to feed her children. The money became real, not as luxury but as freedom, as the ability to honor Daniel's sacrifice by giving their children the life he had dreamed of, as the power to build something beautiful from the ashes of Victoria's destruction, and most importantly, as the guarantee that fear would never again dictate Claire's choices or threaten her family's survival. Claire's first decisions with her newfound security were not about luxury but about gratitude and legacy, and she began by purchasing Margaret's diner for a price that allowed the older woman to retire comfortably to the small house by the lake she had always dreamed of, ensuring that the woman who had given Claire work when no one else would could finally rest after decades of serving others. She established college funds for Emma and the baby that would guarantee their education regardless of what the future held, and she purchased a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, not the mansion that $75 million could have bought, but rather a real home with a backyard where children could play, and windows that let in sunlight and rooms that could be filled with warmth and laughter instead of the cold elegance of the Ashworth estate. The foundation she created in Daniel's name became her greatest pride, an organization dedicated to helping women and children escape dangerous family situations, providing legal aid and safe housing, and the resources to rebuild shattered lives, turning her own suffering into purpose that would help countless others. Mr. Watkins accepted her offer to become an official advisor and Emma's honorary grandfather, and when Claire went into labor 3 weeks later, it was Margaret and Mr. Watkins who sat with Emma in the hospital waiting room, and when Claire's son was born healthy and perfect, she named him Daniel William Ashworth, honoring both the husband who had loved her enough to protect her and the grandfather who had tried to save them all. 6 months later, Claire stood in her bright kitchen with its windows overlooking the backyard where Emma pushed baby Daniel in his swing, their laughter floating through the open door like music, and she marveled at how completely she had been transformed from the terrified woman who had spent that first night shivering in a car. She visited Daniel's grave regularly, placing fresh flowers and sitting in the grass to tell him everything, about Emma's progress in her new school, about baby Daniel's first smile, about the custody battle she had won, and the foundation bearing his name that was already helping dozens of families, and she thanked him for the envelope, for trusting her with truth that had set them free even as it had revealed how much he had sacrificed to protect them. At home, she had framed his final letter and hung it in her bedroom where she could see it every morning, a reminder of love and sacrifice, and the strength she had discovered within herself when circumstances demanded she become more than she believed possible. That evening, as she rocked baby Daniel to sleep with Emma cuddled warm beside her, Claire finally felt the peace that had eluded her since the moment Victoria's door had slammed shut, and she understood that the storm which had thrown her out into the rain had actually liberated her from a life lived in ignorance, had forced her to fight and grow and become someone capable of protecting what mattered most. And she was no longer the frightened woman with no choices, but rather Claire Ashworth, mother and fighter and survivor, finally and truly home.